The day I discovered my 23-year-old son had hidden recording devices throughout our house and had been selling our most intimate family moments as content for his podcast about surviving toxic parents, while making over $200,000 portraying us as monsters, was the day I realized that the boy I raised had become a stranger who valued viral fame and money over the family that loved him unconditionally. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I'm 68 years old, sitting in what used to be my son's childhood bedroom in our home in Scottsdale, Arizona, where I just found the 17th hidden recording device tucked inside a stuffed animal he gave his mother for her birthday, while secretly documenting our private conversations for his audience of 300,000 subscribers, who think they know our family based on carefully edited clips designed to make us look like abusive parents. Let me explain how we got here, because this isn't just about invasion of privacy or betrayal, but about how social media and the hunger for content has turned our own children into predators willing to destroy their families for clicks, views, and Patreon donations from strangers who want to feel superior by judging other people's parenting based on out-of-context recordings. My son Christopher was always intelligent and creative, but also manipulative in ways that concerned me even when he was young, like when he would record his sister crying. After he provoked her, then play only the crying part to make it seem like she was the problem, or when he would secretly film family arguments on his phone claiming he was just texting friends. His mother, Rebecca, defended him, saying he was just technologically savvy, and we needed to respect his interests. But I saw something darker in the way he would smirk when reviewing his recordings and the calculated way he would instigate situations that he knew would create drama worth capturing on his ever-present devices. We weren't perfect parents, but we tried our best, providing Christopher and his sister Sarah with everything they needed, including private schools, college tuition, and emotional support through all their challenges. But apparently, our best wasn't good enough for Christopher, who found it more profitable to paint us as villains than to acknowledge the privileged life we had given him. The podcast started 3 years ago when Christopher was in college at Arizona State University studying communications, and told us he was creating content about family dynamics for a class project, which seemed harmless enough. And we even agreed to let him interview us, thinking we were supporting his education, not providing material for his future character assassination. What we didn't know was that he had been recording us for years before that, starting when he was 16, and received his first smartphone, which he immediately weaponized against us by placing it strategically during family dinners, arguments, and private conversations between Rebecca and me that we thought were happening behind closed doors. The recordings went back 7 years and included everything from discussions about our marriage troubles that we worked through to financial concerns during the recession, to private medical information about Rebecca's depression and my anxiety that we had never shared with anyone outside our therapist, but which Christopher presented to his audience as evidence of our instability and unfitness as parents. He had recorded Sarah's mental health crisis when she was 15, including her suicide attempt and hospitalization, which he discussed in detail on his podcast, calling us negligent parents who drove her to it, when in reality, we had done everything possible to help her, including family therapy, individual counseling, and adjusting our entire lives to support her recovery. The podcast was called Surviving the Thompsons, and each episode focused on a different aspect of what Christopher called our toxic family dynamic, using real recordings, but edited to remove context and spliced together to create narratives that never actually happened, but sounded convincing enough to his audience, who had no way of knowing they were being manipulated. For example, he had an episode about financial abuse where he played clips of me discussing budget concerns and saying we needed to cut back on spending, but removed the part where I was talking about my own discretionary spending, not the family budget, and definitely not trying to control anyone through money, as he implied to his listeners. Another episode focused on emotional manipulation, using recordings of Rebecca crying during a particularly difficult period when her mother was dying of cancer. But Christopher presented it as evidence of her mental instability and tendency to use tears to control the family rather than a woman grieving the loss of her mother, while trying to hold everything together. He created characters out of us with me portrayed as the controlling patriarch who ruled through fear and financial dominance, while Rebecca was the enabler mother who was too weak to protect her children from my supposed tyranny, and Sarah was the broken sister whose mental health issues were supposedly caused by our toxic parenting, rather than the complex combination of genetics and circumstances that actually contributed to her struggles. The monetization was sophisticated, with Patreon tiers ranging from $5 for basic access to $100 for exclusive content, including unedited recordings and live streams, where Christopher would answer questions about surviving toxic families, while his subscribers paid to hear more dirt about the parents they had been taught to hate through carefully crafted narrative manipulation. He had sponsorship deals with therapy apps and self-help companies who thought they were supporting a survivor of abuse, not realizing they were enabling a con artist who was manufacturing trauma for profit, while his actual trauma-free childhood was spent in a 5-bedroom house with a pool and parents who attended every soccer game, school play, and graduation. The merchandise was perhaps the most insulting part, with t-shirts saying "Survivor" and "No Contact is Self-Care" being sold to his audience, while Christopher was still living at home during college breaks, eating Rebecca's cooking and accepting money from us for his expenses, all while recording every interaction for future content that would paint us as the enemy. We discovered the truth accidentally when Sarah found the podcast after a coworker mentioned hearing a familiar story and recognized details that could only have come from our family, despite Christopher using fake names and claiming we lived in California to maintain his anonymity, while destroying our reputation to anyone who might connect the dots. Sarah called me crying, saying, "You need to hear this," and sent me links to dozens of episodes where our most private moments had been transformed into entertainment for strangers who commented about what horrible people we were, and how brave Christopher was for sharing his truth when his truth was nothing but lies built on a foundation of illegally recorded conversations. I confronted Christopher immediately, and his response was chilling in its casualness, as he said it was just content, and everyone does it, and we should be happy he was successful instead of upset about how he achieved that success, as if violating our privacy and destroying our reputation was just another form of social media marketing. He actually tried to justify it by saying we had emotionally abused him his entire life, and this was his way of processing the trauma. But when I asked for specific examples of abuse, he could only point to normal parenting decisions like limiting screen time when he was younger, or asking him to contribute to household chores, or expecting him to maintain certain grades to keep his car privileges. Rebecca was devastated discovering that conversations she thought were private between mother and son had been broadcast to hundreds of thousands of strangers, including discussions about her own childhood trauma that she had shared with Christopher, thinking she was building trust and connection, not providing content for his podcast about intergenerational trauma. The legal implications were significant because Arizona is a one-party consent state, meaning Christopher technically hadn't broken the law by recording conversations. He was part of but the recordings of private conversations between Rebecca and me that he wasn't present for were illegal, and we had grounds for both criminal charges and civil litigation. We hired an attorney who specialized in privacy law and cyber harassment, but Christopher had been smart enough to maintain plausible deniability about the recordings. He wasn't present for claiming he had found them, or they had been sent to him by anonymous sources, which we knew was bullshit, but would be hard to prove in court. The cease and desist letter we sent resulted in Christopher doubling down and creating a special series about being silenced by his abusers, and how the legal system enables toxic parents to continue their abuse through litigation, which generated more sympathy and donations from his audience, who saw us as the powerful oppressors trying to silence their hero. He moved out immediately, but not before stealing family photos, documents, and even medical records that he would later use as proof in his podcast, including Rebecca's psychiatric evaluations from her depression treatment, and my therapy notes that he had somehow accessed through our home computer, which showed a complete violation of any boundary of privacy or decency. The damage to our reputation was immediate and severe, with people in our community who had found the podcast treating us differently, and Sarah's employer actually calling her in to discuss whether her family situation might affect her work performance based on what they had heard in Christopher's podcast about our supposed dysfunction and toxicity. Rebecca's brother found the podcast and called, accusing us of being terrible parents, and saying he finally understood why Christopher had always seemed so troubled, when in reality Christopher had been the trouble manufacturing drama where none existed, and then selling it as truth to anyone willing to pay for the content. We tried family therapy with a specialist in family estrangement, but Christopher refused to attend unless we agreed to admit to the abuse he claimed happened and pay him damages for the trauma he had supposedly endured, which was essentially extortion, but wrapped in the language of healing and accountability that made us look like the unreasonable ones for refusing. The podcast episodes about our attempts at reconciliation were the worst, with Christopher recording our therapy sessions without consent, and then editing them to make it seem like we were gaslighting him when we disputed his version of events that we knew were fabricated, because we had lived through the actual moments he was misrepresenting for profit. Sarah became his next target when she publicly defended us, posting on social media about how Christopher was lying and had actually had a privileged childhood with loving parents who had done everything for him. But he twisted this into evidence of how the family system turned siblings against each other, and how Sarah was still trapped in the toxic dynamic. He released episodes featuring recordings of Sarah from when she was at her lowest during her mental health crisis, including conversations with her therapist that he had recorded through devices hidden in her room, which was not just a violation of privacy, but potentially dangerous to her recovery, as she felt betrayed and exposed in the most vulnerable moments of her life. The financial impact was significant, with the podcast generating over $200,000 through various revenue streams, while we spent $50,000 on legal fees trying to stop him, and thousands more on therapy to deal with the trauma of having our son turn us into content, and our lives into entertainment for strangers who paid to hear our pain. Christopher used the money to fund his lifestyle as a full-time content creator, moving to Los Angeles, where he networked with other influencers who specialized in family trauma content, and even appeared on larger podcasts where he would retell his manufactured story of survival to increasingly larger audiences who had no idea they were being sold fiction as fact. He started coaching others on how to monetize their family trauma, offering courses on recording techniques, editing for maximum emotional impact, and building an audience of supporters who would pay for the content and defend you against any criticism or attempts by your family to correct the narrative, which was essentially teaching others to do what he had done to us. The relationship coaching service he launched was particularly ironic, with Christopher charging hundreds of dollars to advise people on setting boundaries with toxic family members and healing from childhood trauma when he had created the trauma he claimed to be healing from and had violated every boundary that exists between parents and children. Rebecca found devices hidden throughout the house, including in our bathroom, and even in the car, which meant nothing we had said or done in years had been private, and every moment of our lives had been potential content for Christopher's podcast, where we were the villains in a story he had written, and we had no way to defend ourselves. The paranoia that developed from knowing we had been recorded for years was crippling, with both Rebecca and I afraid to have honest conversations, even after removing all the devices, because we didn't know if Christopher had other ways of monitoring us, or if he had enlisted others to spy on us for fresh content to keep his audience engaged. Our marriage suffered tremendously as we questioned everything we had said to each other over the years, wondering what had been recorded and how it had been edited, and whether arguments we had resolved years ago were now being presented as ongoing abuse to Christopher's audience, who thought they knew the truth about our relationship. Sarah moved across the country to escape the situation, but Christopher tracked her down and started reporting on her new life, claiming she was repeating family patterns and would become toxic like us, which affected her new relationships as people Googled her and found the podcast that painted her entire family as dysfunctional and dangerous. The extended family took sides, with some believing Christopher's version of events because he was so convincing in his victim narrative, while others saw through the manipulation. But the damage was done, and family gatherings became impossible as trust had been completely destroyed by Christopher's actions and the doubt he had planted in everyone's minds. We discovered Christopher had been planning this for years, with journals dating back to high school, where he had written about his strategy to document the family and eventually monetize the content. Once he built a platform which showed this wasn't a response to trauma, but a calculated plan to exploit his family for profit. The journal entries were chilling in their detachment, referring to us not as parents, but as subjects, and discussing how to provoke reactions that would record well and create compelling content, including deliberately causing arguments, and then editing out his instigation to make us look unstable and aggressive. He had studied other family trauma influencers, taking notes on what worked and what didn't, and had deliberately crafted his online persona to maximum sympathy and engagement, including fake therapy sessions, where he would cry on camera about his supposed abuse, while knowing that we were watching and couldn't respond without looking like the abusers he claimed we were. The podcast expanded into a book deal with a major publisher who offered Christopher a six-figure advance to write about his experience surviving toxic parents, and he used our real names in the book proposal, though the publisher required him to change them for legal reasons, but the damage to our reputation was already done. Rebecca's career as a school counselor was affected when parents found the podcast and complained about her working with children, given what Christopher had said about her mental health and parenting, which led to an investigation that cleared her, but left a cloud of suspicion that would never fully dissipate. My reputation in the business community was similarly damaged, with clients questioning whether they wanted to work with someone who had been portrayed as an abusive father, even though they knew me personally and had never seen any evidence of the behavior Christopher described in his podcast, but doubt once planted is hard to uproot. We considered suing for defamation, but our lawyer explained that proving damages would be difficult, and the lawsuit would only bring more attention to the podcast, potentially increasing Christopher's audience and revenue, while costing us hundreds of thousands in legal fees, with no guarantee of success, given the complex nature of online content law. The parallel between Christopher's behavior and actual abuse was ironic, with him doing everything. He accused us of including gaslighting, manipulation, financial exploitation, and emotional cruelty, but wrapped in the language of survival and healing that made him the hero, and us the villains in a narrative we couldn't control or correct. Friends who had known our family for decades began to distance themselves, not because they believed Christopher's lies, but because they didn't want to be associated with the drama or potentially become subjects in his content if they maintained relationships with us, which left us increasingly isolated and alone. The therapy industry that Christopher claimed to support actually condemned his actions when the full truth came out, with several prominent therapists writing about the ethics of recording therapy sessions and family conversations without consent, and the damage it does to genuine survivors of abuse when fake stories are monetized and promoted. Christopher's response to criticism was always to claim that questioning his truth was a form of abuse, and that anyone who defended us was either an enabler or an abuser themselves, which created an echo chamber of supporters who would attack anyone who suggested that maybe recording your family secretly for years and selling the content wasn't the behavior of a victim, but of a perpetrator. We found out he had been recording since he was 14, which meant we had no idea which memories were real and which were performed for recording devices, and whether moments we treasured as genuine family connections were actually Christopher gathering content for future exploitation, which tainted every happy memory we had of his childhood. The birth of our first grandchild through Sarah should have been a joy, but was overshadowed by fear that Christopher would somehow exploit this too, and we had to take legal measures to prevent him from discussing the baby on his podcast, though he found ways around it by talking about becoming an uncle to a child he would never meet because of family toxicity. Rebecca developed severe anxiety and trust issues, unable to feel safe even in our own home, knowing it had been turned into a recording studio without our consent, and that our most vulnerable moments had been broadcast to strangers who paid to consume our pain as entertainment, while believing they were supporting a survivor. I struggled with anger and betrayal, trying to understand how the son we had loved and supported could do this to us, and whether we had somehow failed as parents in ways we couldn't see, or if Christopher was simply someone who valued money and fame over family and had found a market for our destruction. The financial success of the podcast made everything worse, because Christopher could point to his income and audience as validation that he was telling the truth, when in reality it just proved that people will pay for drama regardless of whether it's real, and that the more sensational the story, the more profitable it becomes in the attention economy. We learned that Christopher had coached other young people to do the same thing to their families, creating a network of content creators who specialized in family exploitation and trauma, manufacturing, teaching them how to record, edit, and monetize their families' private moments, while maintaining plausible deniability about consent and legality. The term toxic parents became a weapon that Christopher and others like him wielded against any parent who set boundaries, expected responsibility, or didn't provide unlimited financial support with normal parenting, reframed as abuse and actual abuse, minimized by the flood of manufactured trauma content flooding social media. Sarah's therapy was derailed by the podcast, as she had to spend sessions dealing with the violation of having her mental health crisis broadcast to strangers rather than working on her actual recovery. And she developed trust issues that affected her ability to form relationships, knowing that anyone could be recording her for content. The generational impact was significant, with our extended family's children learning that recording adults without their knowledge was acceptable behavior, and that family conflicts were content opportunities rather than private matters to be resolved within the family, which created a culture of surveillance and performance rather than genuine connection. We discovered Christopher had installed keyloggers on our computers and had access to our emails, text messages, and even financial accounts, which he used to gather information for his podcast, including private communications with our attorneys about the cease and desist, which he spun as evidence of us trying to silence and control him through legal intimidation. The violation went deeper when we learned he had shared intimate details about our sex life that he had gathered from recordings in our bedroom, presenting our private moments as evidence of dysfunction, and using our vulnerability as content for episodes about toxic relationship dynamics that were completely fabricated from edited audio. Rebecca attempted suicide after a particularly cruel episode where Christopher had used recordings of her discussing her father's death to paint her as emotionally unstable and manipulative, which led to harassment from his followers who sent her messages saying she deserved to lose her son and that Christopher was brave for escaping such a toxic mother. The hospitalization following her attempt became more content for Christopher, who posted about the guilt of having a mentally ill parent and how he was processing the trauma of his mother's suicide attempt that he had directly caused through his actions, but spun as another consequence of our supposed toxicity. I had to take early retirement because the stress and damage to my professional reputation made it impossible to continue working effectively, and the financial strain of legal fees, medical bills, and therapy costs decimated our retirement savings, while Christopher continued to profit from our destruction, claiming financial success as proof that he was living his truth. The investigation by authorities was limited because the laws hadn't caught up to technology, and much of what Christopher did fell into legal gray areas, where privacy invasion and harassment were difficult to prosecute, especially when wrapped in the language of memoir and personal narrative that had First Amendment protections. We moved to a different state, trying to start over, but Christopher tracked our location and announced it on his podcast, leading to his followers finding us and continuing the harassment in our new community, where we had hoped to find peace and anonymity away from the nightmare he had created. The new house was swept for recording devices multiple times, but we could never feel secure knowing that technology was always advancing, and Christopher was always looking for new ways to survey us, having turned stalking his own parents into a profitable business model that his audience supported and encouraged. Rebecca and I considered divorce not because we didn't love each other, but because the strain of being performed for an audience we couldn't see, and having our relationship dissected by strangers, had damaged our ability to be vulnerable with each other, knowing that any moment of weakness could become content for Christopher's next episode. Sarah legally changed her last name and cut contact with everyone who might give Christopher information about her life. But the trauma of having her worst moments sold as entertainment left scars that therapy could only partially heal, and she struggled with whether to have children knowing what Christopher had done to his family. The ripple effects extended to our professional networks, with colleagues treating us differently, and some avoiding us entirely, not wanting to risk being mentioned in the podcast or associated with what they saw as a messy family situation, even though they knew us to be good people caught in an impossible situation. We joined a support group for parents estranged from their children, but had to leave when we discovered one of the members was feeding information to Christopher about what we shared in what we thought was a confidential setting, which showed how deeply his surveillance network extended and how nowhere was truly safe from his content gathering. The psychological evaluation required for the legal proceedings revealed that Christopher showed signs of antisocial personality disorder, with a complete lack of empathy for the harm he was causing, and an inability to see his family as anything other than resources to be exploited for personal gain, which explained, but didn't excuse his behavior. The evaluator noted that Christopher's ability to maintain his victim narrative, while actively victimizing others, showed a level of manipulation and cognitive dissonance that was concerning and suggested he was capable of escalating his behavior if his current revenue stream was threatened, which made us fear what he might do next. We hired a private investigator to document Christopher's actual lifestyle versus what he presented online, and discovered he was living lavishly while claiming to be struggling financially due to family abandonment, using the sympathy of his audience to generate more donations, while spending the money on luxury items and trips that he carefully kept off his social media. The evidence we gathered showed Christopher coaching other content creators on how to provoke family reactions that would record well, including suggesting ways to trigger parents' emotional responses, and how to edit conversations to remove context and create narratives that would generate the most engagement and revenue from their audiences. This network of family exploiters had created a support system for each other, validating their actions and sharing techniques for monetizing family trauma, while portraying themselves as survivors and advocates when they were actually perpetrators, creating the very trauma they claimed to be healing from. The legal battle eventually resulted in a restraining order preventing Christopher from discussing us publicly, but he found ways around it by having other content creators share his story, and by creating fictional narratives that were obviously about us, but with enough plausible deniability to avoid legal consequences while continuing to profit from our pain. Rebecca's therapist said she had never seen such a clear case of child-to-parent abuse enabled by technology and social media, and that the trauma we experienced was similar to victims of long-term surveillance and harassment, but with the added betrayal of it coming from our own child who we had loved and trusted. The book Christopher published became a bestseller, with readers having no idea they were consuming fiction marketed as memoir, and his success led to speaking engagements where he would teach others how to recognize toxic family patterns while demonstrating the very toxicity he claimed to be fighting against. We discovered he had been recording other family members, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, creating a vast archive of content he could deploy whenever he needed fresh material, or when his audience engagement started dropping, which showed the industrial scale of his exploitation. The family reunion stopped entirely, as no one trusted that conversations wouldn't be recorded and monetized, and the extended family fractured into those who believed Christopher, those who believed us, and those who simply wanted to avoid the entire situation, which meant the destruction of generations of family bonds. Sarah's wedding was conducted in secret, with only a handful of trusted friends present and security hired to prevent Christopher from attending or sending someone to record the event, as we had learned that every family milestone was a content opportunity in his eyes, and nothing was sacred or off-limits. The granddaughter Sarah was kept completely secret from Christopher, and most of the extended family, with Sarah using a different name on all medical records and avoiding social media entirely to protect her child from becoming content for her brother's podcast about intergenerational trauma and family patterns. We learned to live with constant vigilance, checking for recording devices, scanning for hidden cameras, and being careful about every word we said, even in private, because the violation had been so complete that we could never fully trust that we weren't being monitored, or that someone in our lives wasn't feeding information to Christopher for money or access. The cost of Christopher's success was the complete destruction of our family, with Sarah losing a brother, Rebecca, and I losing a son, and all of us losing the sense of safety and privacy that should exist within a family, but which Christopher had sold to the highest bidder while portraying himself as the victim in a story where he was actually the villain. If you like this story, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left